Hi everyone, my name is David J. Kent, and in celebration of the release of my new book, Lincoln in New England, In Search of His Forgotten Tours, I'm going to give some background on some Lincoln's relationship with each of the six New England states, so one per video, and this is the fifth in that series, and today we're talking about New Hampshire. So Lincoln, of course, was in New England twice in his life, and it was on the second trip in 1860 that he spent about 4 days in New Hampshire. So ostensibly, he was there to visit his son Robert at Phillips Exeter Academy in southern New Hampshire. Robert was there studying to retake the Harvard entrance exams that he had failed the previous summer. So Lincoln went up there, he did Cooper Union, and then he went up to New Hampshire to visit Robert. Well, instead, he was met on the train station platform when he arrived, and he committed, before he left, he was committed to give four speeches based on this Cooper Union speech. So he would give speeches over the next 3 days in Concord, Manchester, Dover, and Exeter, all in southern New Hampshire. And then he would spend Sunday with Robert. So there is a Lincoln, New Hampshire. Has nothing to do with Lincoln, existed before Lincoln. It was actually named after the British Earl of Lincoln. So that had nothing to do with him. Now, there are some key people in New Hampshire that are connected to Lincoln. One of them is Lewis Cass. He was born in Exeter. He eventually moved to Ohio, he became a senator for Michigan. But he was the Democratic nominee for president in 1848. So when Lincoln, as a congressman, went up to Massachusetts to campaign for Zachary Taylor, the Whig nominee, he was also there to keep people from voting for Lewis Cass, the Democratic nominee. Now, I'll mention that election again in a minute. Now, 4 years later, Franklin Pierce became the only president before or since from New Hampshire. And he ended up in 1852 beating the Whig, who was Winfield Scott, was the Whig nominee. So Franklin Pierce became president in 1852. So I'll come back and touch on those two dates again in a minute. Now, Daniel Webster was from New Hampshire. We think of him as the Massachusetts senator, one of the three great orators of the time, but he was born in New Hampshire, a little bit northwest of Concord. There is a statue of him in front of the State House in Concord. So he was very much remembered as a New Hampshireite, even though most people like me from Massachusetts consider him from Massachusetts. Another person that has a statue in front of that State House in Concord is a woman by the name of Christa McAuliffe. You may or may not know that name. She was called the first teacher in space. Unfortunately, she was one of the 7 Challenger shuttle astronauts that were killed when the Challenger shuttle exploded 7 seconds after takeoff in 1986. She has a statue there. Now, since I'm talking about statues, one of the big sculptors is Augustus St. Gaudens, and he has a huge, beautiful studio in Cornish, New Hampshire, which I highly recommend people go to. He's the one who did the standing Lincoln, pretty famous standing Lincoln that's in Chicago, and there's a copy in Parliament Square in London. He also did a big statue of David Farragut, which of course was before Lincoln. That's in Madison Square Park in New York City. And he was the sculptor of the Robert Gould Shaw 54th Massachusetts Regiment statue or memorial, that the original of which sits across the street from the Massachusetts State House in Boston along the edge of Boston Common. All of these and others are their recastings, are all there in that Cornish, New Hampshire studio. Now, interestingly enough, Augustus St. Gaudens was only one of 2 sculptors who Robert Lincoln liked, the other being Daniel Chester French, who sculpted the statue of Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial. And I'm sure it's just a coincidence, but those are the only 2 sculptors who ever consulted Robert about their sculptures, and Robert provided feedback that they supposedly incorporated. So he liked those two sculptors. He didn't like any other sculptor of Lincoln. Another New Hampshireite that's important is Amos Tuck. He was a fellow congressman with Lincoln in 1848 and remained in Congress. He became a close friend, and part of the reason Robert was in Exeter is because Tuck lived in Exeter, and Lincoln liked the idea of Robert having some friend of the family that could kind of look out over him. Tuck was an interesting guy. He was considered for Lincoln's cabinet. I don't know how seriously. He did get made a naval officer in Boston during the war. And he was one of these people that didn't so much care for party affiliation. He basically do what he wanted to do. He had been a Democrat. He had been a Liberty Party. He had been an independent. He was in Free Soil Party. He was a Whig. And then he helped found the New Hampshire Republican Party. So he wasn't just in those parties, switching from one to another. He helped found those parties in New Hampshire, the New Hampshire version of them. So he was an interesting guy. But even more interesting, and there always seems to be somebody that just sort of stands out as an interesting character, both in good and bad ways. And in New Hampshire, that's Senator John Parker Hale. He also has a statue at the Concord State House. He was a former Democrat. He was actually the nominee for the Liberty Party presidential nomination in 1848, but then he and the vice presidential nominee both withdrew and threw their support to the Free Soil candidate in 1848, who was Martin Van Buren, who was the other person that Lincoln was telling people, don't vote for him, don't vote for Cass, don't vote for Van Buren, vote for Taylor. So all this kind of comes together. So he until he withdrew, he was the nominee in 1848 for the Liberty Party, and then he became the nominee in 1852 for the Free Soil Party in that race where Franklin Pierce became the first and only president from New Hampshire. So Parker was pretty well known in politics. He became a senator during the Civil War. He had a tendency not to get along with people. He didn't get along at all with Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles, in part because Hale thought that he should have that job. He should be the Secretary of the Navy. He also didn't get along too well with Ward Hill Layman, who was a good friend and protector of Lincoln during the war. So he had a tendency to tick off kind of the wrong people. He also had some issues with corruption. And so in 1864, for the 1864 election, he actually supported Chase to replace Lincoln until that fell apart. And the state decided that, for the election, that they weren't going to ask him to be the senator anymore. They would find him somewhere else. Now, interestingly, Lincoln decided anyway in the spring of 1865 to appoint him to be the minister of Spain. Now, in part, that may be just to get rid of him. But a couple of interesting things relate to that. One is Hale had gone to the White House on April 14th of 1865 and met with Lincoln to discuss this appointment to the minister of Spain. And they discussed things and they walked away. They were friendly enough. And then Lincoln had the rest of his meetings, and then he went out to the theater that night at Ford's Theater. Well, it turns out that night is when Lincoln gets assassinated. John Wilkes Booth is now on the run for 12 days. They finally catch up to him in Virginia, and he's shot and he dies. And on his body, in his clothing, they find several pictures of young women, presumably girlfriends. Well, one of them is Lucy Hale, who is the daughter of John Parker Hale, who had just met with Lincoln that day. So Lucy Hale apparently had been engaged to John Wilkes Booth. And in fact, Lucy Hale had made arrangements for Booth to be at the inauguration a few weeks before and in kind of the area above where Lincoln was giving his speech. And depending on if you believe any of the stories, he may have like tried to make a move and try to force himself to try to attack Lincoln at that time. But he didn't, and ends up murdering him in on April 14th. And Lucy Hale is engaged to him. She goes off with her father to Spain. She eventually marries another senator and lives a reasonable life. Now, I mentioned early on that Lincoln had gone to Exeter to visit his son, and before he even got a chance to talk to his son, he is met at the train station upon arrival by this committee that get him to commit to four speeches. Well, the head of that committee was George Benn, and he had heard that Lincoln was on his way up there, so he had written to Robert without actually knowing Robert's first name. So he wrote, Lincoln, son of a Lincoln. And then he asked him, he said, could your father deliver at an address on popular political topics before the citizens of Dover previous to our state election? And Robert responded to him by telegraph. He said, well, he's on his way up here. I'll talk to him when he gets here, but I'm sure he would do it. But then Robert didn't even get a chance to talk to his father because they were there on the platform to basically accost him. So Lincoln gets this, and he writes. He sits down that night and he writes to a guy by the name of John Candy in Connecticut, pleading with him. He says, they, meaning the people in New Hampshire, they have got me into such trouble here that I must postpone your Connecticut meetings. Because he had already been committed to speak several times in Connecticut after his stop in New Hampshire. But now he had to extend that, and he writes them and he says, we've got to change the dates around. And he tells them, I want you to do Hartford on this date and New Haven on this date. Now, those three speeches got switched into several more speeches and rearranged a little bit more. But, he basically didn't expect to be giving speeches in New Hampshire. Now, I've been mentioning how the New England states helped Lincoln win the nomination. And New Hampshire also did that. New Hampshire, on the first ballot, they had 10 votes. 7 of them they gave to Lincoln. And they gave one each to Seward, to Chase, and to Bates. So they kind of cover their bases. Remember, Seward expected New England to just vote for him. He's right next door in New York. He had been a leader for a long time. So they gave 7 to Lincoln and split the other 3. In the second ballot, 9 out of 10 went to Lincoln, and the one sole vote went to Seward, which they just kept in the third ballot as well. And of course, after Ohio switched the 4 votes, New Hampshire moved all of their votes to Lincoln, and as did many other states. Most of the states switched over to Lincoln. The big exception, of course, was New York. So that's New Hampshire. I talk a lot about New Hampshire in the book because he spends a decent amount of time there, and there's some interesting things going on. So that's New Hampshire. Now the next one, which should be the last one, is Connecticut, which is the last state he's in before he starts heading home, and I'll talk about that in the next video.